All right, so in this video, we're going to be talking about some more issues concerning demand and supply. We've introduced demand and understand that it is the curve that shows us the quantities a consumer is willing to buy at a particular price. And when we also have the supply curve, we put the two together, and where they're equal, we have the magical point where the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are equal at the exact same price. And so here I've just drawn in, without seeing the supply curve, I'm assuming that this will be our P star, our equilibrium price, and this will then be our Q star, equilibrium quantity. So we take that as given and just focus on the demand curve. What we want to look at in this video is recognizing the fact that everybody in this market is paying this price, because that is the going market price, and yet a lot of the units, all the units, before you get to Q star, have more than P star value to the consumers. Okay, so the demand curve then, just to remind us, is what price someone is willing to pay for each quantity. And so we see that they're willing to pay these much higher than P star prices for all these quantities before Q star. So maybe we can look at it this way. So for this quantity, the consumer is willing and able to pay that price. And at this quantity, the consumer is willing and able to pay that price. So at all these quantities, they're willing and able to pay a price higher than the market. And so what we're calling this wonderful bonus to the consumer is consumer surplus. The fact that they're willing to pay more, but then they don't actually have to. That distance, or that space here under the demand curve and above the market price, is representing that surplus value to them. So this verbal definition over here of consumer surplus can help you find it on a graph. Find the market price, of course, find the demand curve. And what we were describing as the bonus to the consumer is this area below the demand curve and above the market price, because at each point on the demand curve, we're seeing the surplus to the consumer. They were willing to pay this price, they have to pay this much lower one. They're willing to pay this price, they only have to pay this, and so forth. So this whole area here, this triangle, is our consumer surplus. Okay, so now we can flip over to the supply side of the market and just focus on the supply curve here. We are still going to take as given that we have a market price of P star, and at P star, we're going to have a market equilibrium of Q star. So you can imagine a demand curve coming through here, and the two together establishing the equilibrium price and quantity. So from the supplier's point of view, suppliers like higher prices, but they are willing to accept prices along the supply curve for each one of these particular quantities. So we see then for this quantity, they're willing and able to accept this price. They can produce this quantity of goods and sell it for that price, and this quantity of goods at that price. So the supply curve is telling us the minimum price a producer can accept in order to supply a particular quantity. So for them, they're looking at it like, okay, this is what I've got to be paid. Whatever quantity we're looking at, this is the price I need, and at this quantity I need this price. But like on the consumer side, there is a market price. And so they're going to receive this P star dollar amount, even though all they would need, say, at this quantity is this price here. And so again, we have this capturing of a bonus from their point of view. They get to accept this price. They were willing to accept this price. And this distance between these two, the market price and the supply curve, is capturing the producer surplus. So the producer surplus is the area below the market price and above the supply curve. So when you're trying to find producer surplus on a graph, you can think about this verbal definition here, that you would find the supply curve, you would find the market price, and so it's the area below the market price and above the supply curve that's capturing the fact that the producer is willing to accept a lower price and is happy to accept a much higher price, and that's their producer surplus. Okay, so now we see our demand and supply curve together, and this is going to be our last look at consumer surplus and producer surplus. We see that we have our equilibrium price, P star, and our equilibrium quantity, Q star, where the demand curve and the supply curve cross. There's your market equilibrium. So using our newfound definitions, then we know that our consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the market price, so that area is marked A. And the producer surplus is the area below the market price and above the supply curve. And that area is marked B for the producer surplus. But I also want to talk about it in another way, just another way to help you understand why these areas are so magical. So one thing I want to point out is for the consumer, the total value of the product they're looking at buying is represented as the distance from the demand curve all the way down to a price of 0 to where the good is free. If all we're talking about is the value, when we say, for example, that this quantity here is worth this price, it's because to the consumer that unit is bringing them an additional benefit that is worth P dollars, okay? So every point on the demand curve is representing the additional benefit, the true P dollar value to the consumer for that unit, okay? So graphically then, the total value to the consumer is this entire distance under the demand curve all the way down, or as we have it labeled here, A, B, and C. So A plus B plus C is the total value to the consumer. Now, they don't get it for free. If they did get it for free, the entire consumer surplus would be the value because they're not having to pay anything. But in the real world, you have to pay for stuff that you want. So how much does a consumer pay? Well, we know they're going to pay P dollars, and they're going to pay that price for each unit they buy, which is the Q star. And so your total payment is price times the quantity, and graphically that's this rectangle area here, which is B and C. So we're going to probably see this future applications when you're trying to understand the revenue graphically. Where is it? Total revenue is price times quantity, and then graphically we can see if we're buying each one of these units, that's the number of units at this price, then the area here is in fact the total revenue amount. Now, for the purposes of our consumer surplus discussion, what we're saying then is the consumer values the entire quantity, the Q star they're buying at A plus B plus C, but they actually have to pay for it, and the amount they pay is B plus C. So if we subtract out what they pay from what they value, we can see that the B and the C are going to cross out, and what you're left with is A. And so this is another way to understand why the area under the demand curve and above the market price, A, is their consumer surplus. It's the difference between how much they value the quantities they're buying versus how much they actually had to pay. So the total value is ABC, but it's not a surplus when you pay for it. So the B and C, they've literally paid for it. It's the A that is representing their extra value. Okay, so we can do a similar thing with the producers. So let's look at the producers' reality here. So for them, the reason they are able to come up with a point, say at this quantity it's this price, at this quantity it's this price, is that's the price that covers their cost. So each point on the supply curve then is representing the additional cost, the marginal cost to the producer. So with them, what we want to look at is the difference between what they are paid and what they needed to be paid at minimum. So we've already talked about what they are paid. It's going to be the total revenue that they receive from the consumer. So it's the P star times the Q star. The BC area is their total revenue that they receive. But all they needed to be paid was the area represented by C. For this particular quantity, they had to be paid that price right there, and this quantity that price. So this entire area C represents what they needed to be paid. So if we take the revenue they received, the B plus C, and subtract out the costs they needed to cover, the minimum they needed to be paid just to get them to produce, the C's will cross out, and that leaves us this extra area B, which is representing the amount more they were paid than they needed to be. And of course, that's what we know is the producer surplus, the area below the market price and above the supply curve. All right, so that gives us a good introduction into consumer and producer surplus. From here, we will look a little deeper into what happens when the market is not at equilibrium. We'll look at things called price ceilings and price floors, which will explain why we're not at equilibrium, and then we can examine what impact that has for consumer surplus and producer surplus in the market.